Aquanium Express presents The Oqual Cycle in a Nutshell, the 84-year rhythm of human civilization. English edition, 2024. A book written and narrated by Amjad Farooq, the father of the Oqual cycle. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the discovery of the millennium that would undoubtedly transform humanity's understanding of its relationship with the celestial world in a way that has not been felt since the discovery of heliocentrism by Copernicus in the 16th century. So, let us begin with an overview of the contents of this nail-biting masterpiece. Exhibit 1. What on earth is the Oqual cycle? Exhibit 2. Why should I become cognizant of the Oqual cycle? Exhibit 3. Why is the Oqual cycle a big deal? Exhibit 4. Why does the Oqual cycle wax and wane? Exhibit 5. How do celestial forces power the Oqual cycle? Exhibit 6. Is the spell of Oqual cycle stochastic or deterministic? Exhibit 7. What is annus horribilis of the Oqual cycle? Exhibit 8. How does the spell of Oqual cycle determine our fate at an individual level? And Exhibit 9. What does the Oqual cycle have in store for us over the coming decades? Well, sit back, get a cuppa, and enjoy this real-life drama that reaches its finale on our shores once every 84 years on average, and most importantly, being untold in the most unvarnished and unfiltered tone rarely on display in our world marred by propaganda left and right. You are listening to the Oqual cycle in a nutshell with Amjad Farooq, a biophysicist by trade, but a polymath for all intents and purposes with a breathtaking knowledge and intuition of the inner workings of our complex world. And now, Exhibit 1. What on earth is the Oqual cycle? With much of the world having been in a precipitous meltdown over the past couple of decades and continuing to hit a new low with each passing year with no end in sight, one wonders whether this is the new normal or whether the ongoing madness will eventually end so as to usher in a brighter dawn. Fortunately, Mother Nature has blessed us with a hitherto unknown phenomenon dubbed the Oqual cycle that helps us to revitalize our society after we have gone astray, as is the case across much of the globe today. Coined from Latin, the adjective Oqual literally means 84-year. In a manner that the daily cycle lends us an indispensable mechanism for recharging our batteries during the night after a hectic day at work. The Oqual cycle is equally necessary to reboot our society after it becomes corrupted and choppy over what appears to be a period of 84 years on average. Since our childhood, we have not only heard ad nauseum the cliché that history is cyclical, but it has also been shoved down our throat time and again. Well, our gurus and mentors were truly onto something in that we now know that history is in fact aquacyclical. It repeats exactly 84 years on average courtesy of the unavoidable spell of Oqual cycle on our precarious civilization. In short, the Oqual cycle serves as a model par excellence for making sense of the ongoing socio-political trials and tribulations of our own times that in no small part elicit a wistful yearning for the rather sweet memories of our recent past from the second half of the 20th century. Why in the world virtually all nations today have hit rock bottom as if they were joined at the hip? Why almost all countries today are experiencing such a societal meltdown simultaneously or in synchrony with each other? Why has humanity lost its moral compass today? Why are our leaders clueless about how to change course? How will the ongoing madness around the globe end? Are we teetering on the brink of a nuclear Armageddon? When will the good old days return? The Oqual cycle has you covered from every angle. You are listening to the Oqual cycle in a nutshell with Amjad Farouk, a deeply analytical man renowned for pattern recognition and logical approach to life. And now, Exhibit 2. Why should I become cognizant of the Oqual cycle? Imagine an alien landing on Earth in the midst of the summer and with a plenty of wherewithal at his disposal to start a new business in the new world. Barely after having recovered from the jet lag, the alien notices that the ice cream sales are spiking in every city. Without even taking the time to learn about the seasonal trends that not just affect our livelihoods, but to a great extent also dictate our lives and the choices we make as we navigate from one extreme of the summer to the other extreme of the winter. The alien starts to heavily invest in the ice cream business in the hope that the sky-high sales are never going away. Alas, the ice cream sales begin to precipitously dip as the autumn moves in, all the while the alien is left to believe that this is just a temporary blip and continues hiring and scaling up the business to new heights. A few months later, as the winter begins to knock on the door, the alien is all but left bankrupt. However, powered by his celestial hubris and greed, the alien refuses to give up on what he believes to be his entrepreneurial prowess, as he now notices that the glove sales are spiking and quickly moves to auction off his failed ice cream enterprise at pennies on the dollar and diverts the new capital toward the glove business. Barely months into his new venture, the glove sales begin to dry up just as ice cream is making its way back in vogue, leaving the alien befuddled and jumping out of his skin before he finally comes to his senses as he learns about the spell of annual cycle on earthlings and their seasonal rituals. In a manner that the ignorance of the annual cycle planted the downfall of the alien, our own lack of awareness of the Oqual cycle continues to plunge the human society into nothing short of a hell on earth once every 84 years on average. Make no mistake, the onset of World War III in 2022, on the toes of the 84th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II, is no random event, but rather a calamity that was written in the stars, though it could have been averted had humanity learned from its past and paid heed to the dire spell of the Oqual cycle on our civilization. Never in our lifetime have we ever encountered such utter madness, making rounds around the globe with world leaders having turned into ringleaders and openly abetting genocides to add to the complete breakdown of institutions with little or no power at their disposal to change course for the better. It seems as if the law of the jungle has taken center stage in our communities, with the might becoming increasingly right rather than what is actually right. Yet, barely decades earlier, during much of the second half of 20th century, it was not all doom and gloom as many of us would wholeheartedly recall, but rather our society was inundated with plenty of good, though evil always remained in the background even during those good old days from our recent past. Where did those good old days go? Are they ever coming back, or is this the new normal that we must adapt to? None of this makes sense, nor can it be unpacked by even Newtons and Einsteins of our time, unless of course they have the wisdom of the Oqual cycle. You are listening to the Oqual cycle in a nutshell with Amjad Farouk, a deeply philosophical man renowned for traveling down the less trodden path and feeding upon the unknown. And now, Exhibit 3. Why is the Oqual cycle a big deal? On the basis of scientific logic and mathematical modeling of history over the past millennium, the Oqual cycle posits that human civilization seemingly undergoes a sweeping global reset once every 84 years on average in order to purge itself of a plethora of wrongdoings, from the societal ills through excesses and imbalances to transgressions amassed over that multi-decadal period. Unfortunately, there is no free music, as one must pay the piper. Admittedly, such a societal reboot or recalibration is typically accomplished through a global conflict with the potential to not only wreak havoc, but also strike fear into the hearts and minds of people on an apocalyptic scale, so that they can put their socio-political differences aside and come together for the greater good of the world at large. The Oqual cycle therefore lends human society a subtle albeit deadly mechanism to break ties with its dysfunctional past in order to begin anew rather than being held hostage from moving forward under its own weight, or even worse, continue down the rabbit hole in perpetuity with the potential for self-destruction. More specifically, the Oqual cycle posits that the socio-political progress of human civilization does not follow a linear course, but rather it waxes and wanes in a sinusoidal manner over a period of 84 years due to what appears to be its coupling with the orbiting of the second outermost planet Uranus around the Sun. In fact, almost every facet of human civilization, from sociopolitics through economy to climate, appears to be beholden to an 84-year rhythm that propagates in sync with the Oqual cycle in a manner reminiscent of our daily and annual rituals. The Oqual cycle is therefore essentially a lower-order harmonic or eigenvector of the daily and annual cycles, in that the trio seemingly act in a concerted fashion to orchestrate the full gamut of our extraordinary and complex lives. Unlike the daily and annual rhythms that we all experience asynchronously due to our particular time zone and geographical location, the spell of Oqual cycle on our lives is, however, synchronized across the globe, such that it serves to unite the whole of humanity to dance simultaneously to every beat of this celestial symphony. Such a unique and unifying characteristic of the Oqual cycle indeed underlies the synchronization of humanity's trials and triumphs, as we can all attest to the ongoing madness unfolding around the globe today, without any ifs or buts, as if it were under the direct command of a celestial force, which it is, of course. Of particular note is the fact that the Oqual cycle waxes and wanes in lockstep with the southern Uranian year, beginning with the southern spring and ending with the southern winter. The Oqual cycle is therefore precisely based on a systematic or preset calendar that essentially tracks the southern Uranian year, which is equivalent to 84 terrestrial years. Unless otherwise stated from here onward, the Uranian year in the context of Oqual cycle refers to the seasonality with respect to the southern hemisphere of the ice giant. Like the Uranian year, the Oqual cycle is also subdivided into a quartet of 21-year seasons, chronologically dubbed spring, summer, autumn, and winter, with each of such Oqual seasons corresponding to its Uranian counterpart. Given that the current Uranian year and hence the current Oqual cycle began in 1955 and are poised to end in 2038, we are currently in the midst of a long and dark 21-year Uranian winter or Oqual winter 2018 to 2038. A season renowned for a complete societal breakdown, as is the case across much of the globe today. You are listening to the Oqual Cycle in a Nutshell with Amjad Farouk, a selfless and immaterial soul born with a higher purpose in life and equipped with an internal compass to gauge his own impact on society in lieu of external validation, better suited for fraudsters and conmen of our world. And now, Exhibit 4. Why does the Oqual Cycle wax and wane? The Oqual cycle is characterized by two symmetrical or antagonistic halves: a constructive period marked by a rather upbeat zeitgeist, followed by a destructive spell during which the societal zeitgeist turns on its head, with each lasting some 42 years on average. While the constructive period is underscored by decades of relative peace and prosperity over the course of spring and summer, the destructive spell is, however, marred by decades of chaos and meltdown over the course of autumn and winter. Such diametrically opposite zeitgeists unfolding across the two halves of the Oqual cycle seemingly feed upon each other in a positive feedback loop in a manner akin to a hypothetical perpetual machine. In short, the human society comes together during hard times in order to lay down strong foundations based on justice and collectivism, thereby heralding a multi-decadal period of relative peace and prosperity. However, such halcyon days plant their own downfall in that the emergence of a new generation of young people who have never seen hardship in their lives increasingly find their primary solace in self-indulgence and selfish pursuit of individualism over the broader interests of the community as a whole, thereby leading to a breakdown in socio-political homeostasis and the rise of evil practices that are ultimately resolved through an Armageddon with the potential to wreak havoc and strike fear into the hearts and minds of people on an apocalyptic scale. Such a retribution from hell apparently resets the socio-political system back to an organic state so as to lend humanity a fresh start on its socio-political front with the return of several decades of relative peace and prosperity until the triumph of individualism and hedonism once again plunges the human society into an existential crisis culminating with yet another Armageddon. Tellingly, a complex interplay between a plethora of socio-political forces underlies the diametric change of fortunes of our society as we move from one half of the Oqual cycle to the next. For example, the relatively calm and prosperous period during the first half of Oqual cycle is powered by the steady rise of a myriad of progressive tailwinds such as morality, peace, collectivism, globalism, entrepreneurship, moderation, transparency, nonpartisanship, ethnic harmony, baby boom, economic well-being, and institutional trust. On the other hand, the triumph of individualism and hedonism over the greater good of the society during the second half of Oqual cycle fuels the resurgence of a multitude of regressive headwinds such as immorality, conflict, individualism, populism, fraud, debt, corruption, partisanship, xenophobia, baby bust, wealth polarization, and institutional distrust. It is indeed no coincidence that while human society experiences several decades of relative peace and prosperity during the first half of Oqual cycle, the societal straits, however, begin to turn south during the second half, culminating with a hell on earth as the Oqual rhythm draws to a close. Such an Armageddon is all but obligatory to cleanse our society of a baggage of evils that hold us hostage from moving forward to a new experiment, and in doing so, it lends us a new start as it helps us to recalibrate our socio-political system lest we crumble under our own weight. Not only that, but the luminosity of Oqual cycle also helps us to understand ourselves better at an individual level. Why, for example, some people view the world through rose-colored glasses and the society as primarily being a crowd of good people, all the while others perceive the world around them to be largely exploitative and individuals as mostly evil. Such diametrically opposite experiences are indeed very much shaped by the differential spell of Oqual cycle on our lives, in that the first half is underscored by societal good in large quantities, while evil rears its ugly head across every walk of life during the second half. Notably, the mechanics of Oqual cycle are very much akin to an elastic band or a spring that when stretched out will automatically relax back to its equilibrium position when let go. In a manner similar to the fate of a stretched elastic band or spring, the human society today is also under tons of tensional stress or energy that must be released through the outbreak of an Armageddon before it can restore its socio-political equilibrium, just as it did some 84 years ago in the wake of World War II. It should now be clear that, like a winter, the looming Armageddon is unavoidable, though its apocalypticity is hard to predict, just as it is hard to tell in advance whether the coming winter will be more moderate or more severe than its predecessor. Still, without the wisdom of the Oqual cycle, one understands nada about the trials and triumphs of our society, much less be in a position to forecast what the socio-political future holds, as many pundits claim to do so, even though they remain clueless about this newly discovered celestial symphony that apparently orchestrates our every move at every level. How does Uranus orchestrate such a celestial symphony on our planet? This is most likely achieved through modulating the terrestrial climate in a similar manner to how the Earth, in concert with the Sun, powers our daily and annual cycles. You are listening to the Oqual cycle in a nutshell with Amjad Farooq, a rarest of the rare Sigma man destined from birth to illuminate the rather dark world of ours with his beacon of charm and wisdom. And now Exhibit 5. How do celestial forces power the Oqual cycle? On the basis of real-time climate data stretching back centuries, the Earth appears to alternate between two multi-decadal periods dubbed global cooling, followed by global warming, with each stage lasting some 42 years over the course of the Oqual cycle. While global cooling correlates with an upbeat zeitgeist of relative peace and prosperity over the first half of Oqual cycle, global warming, however, seems to take center stage during the second half when our society plunges into decades of chaos and meltdown, as is the case across much of the globe today. Notably, global cooling is underscored by milder temperatures, moderate flooding, weak storms, and relatively wet conditions during the first half. In marked contrast, global warming is powered by sweltering heat, severe flooding, intense storms, and relatively dry conditions during the second half. Such a contrasting change of terrestrial climate that seemingly waltzes in lockstep with the progression of Oqual cycle seems to be the missing link between the 84-year rhythm and its celestial origin. In mechanistic terms, Uranus could orchestrate terrestrial climate through, for example, gravitational coupling or modulating solar wind reaching the Earth in lockstep with its orbital frequency. Importantly, correlation analysis between temperature data and carbon dioxide emissions reveals that the latter is in fact the effect or symptom rather than the cause of global warming observed on our planet over the past several decades. Simply put, Rising temperatures due to astronomical factors spur life from animals to plants on Earth, and the resulting increase in cellular respiration appears to be the primary driver of a rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels in lieu of combustion of fossil fuels. Shamefully, the climate scientists not only have the whole picture upside down, but they have also gone down the rabbit hole from where they can only expect to land in hot water rather than make a safe return. This should hardly raise eyebrows given that most scientists begin to chase money rather than honey as they turn their laboratories into fraudatories and begin to pursue utter garbage during the second half of Oqual's cycle, with the current wave of global warming propaganda having reached a critical mass just as the second half, 1997 to 2038, of the current Aquanium, 1955 to 2038, rolled around. Note that the Aquanium is to an Oqual cycle what the year is to an annual cycle. Admittedly, the unprecedented rise in global temperature coupled with the wrath of natural disasters from droughts through flooding to storms with an increasing frequency and intensity witnessed over the past quarter of a century has nothing to do with the drummed-up specter of irreversible climate change hatched by devious actors around the globe in order to advance their propaganda, but rather primarily due to the multi-decadal period of much derided global warming that is seemingly a hallmark of the second half of Oqual's cycle, with the more friendly global cooling set to return to our shores just as the current Uranian year draws to a close in about a decade or so. In the bigger scheme of things, the Oqual cycle not only serves as a model par excellence for making sense of the rapid climate change swamping our planet, but also the ongoing socio-political trials and tribulations of our own times that in no small part elicit a wistful yearning for the rather sweet memories of our recent past from the second half of the 20th century. For example, our cognizance of the daily cycle or circadian rhythm arms us to set the clock before going to bed so as to wake up at a preset time in the morning and avoid being late for work. Likewise, our knowledge of the annual cycle prepares us in advance of planting and harvesting crops in a timely manner, as well as to brace ourselves for the onset of a hurricane season or the snowstorms of winter ahead. In a similar manner, our understanding of the Oqual cycle equips us to aptly deal with the trials and tribulations awaiting ahead over the coming decades in order to navigate our future with rational wisdom in lieu of blissful ignorance. Just as our appreciation of the daily and annual rhythms helps us to respectively plan for the coming hours and coming months, so too does our awareness of the Oqual cycle for come what may over the coming decades. It is important to recognize that the Oqual cycle does not forecast the future, but rather the future seasonal trends in a similar manner, that on the basis of our understanding of the annual cycle, we are able to prepare in advance in order to avert the crises of a hurricane season or a winter blizzard. Those who disregard the spell of Oqual cycle indeed do so at their own peril. In particular, an understanding of the dire spell of Oqual cycle on human civilization will enable future generations to avoid falling into a socio-political quagmire and avert the outbreak of an Armageddon that pays us homage during Oqual winters once every 84 years on average. You are listening to the Oqual cycle in a nutshell with Amjad Farouk, an indomitable man whose cutthroat approach to life continues to deliver a breath of fresh air and candor in a world where telling the truth is a liability rather than an asset. And now, Exhibit 6. Is the spell of Oqual cycle stochastic or deterministic? Like all astronomical phenomena, the Oqual cycle is by no means set in stone, but rather it is highly malleable, with a plenty of wiggle room to maneuver around, due to an interplay between celestial and societal forces that seemingly form the bedrock of human civilization. In what is dubbed the canonical model, the overall socio-political progress of human society is envisioned to rise during the first half of Oqual cycle and then pivot so as to reverse course during the second half against the backdrop of a socio-political upheaval that is ultimately resolved by an Armageddon so as to yield to a new dawn of hope and prosperity just as the Oqual rhythm comes home. However, due to atypical sociopolitical factors at play, this may not always be the case for every nation or community, as for example the deep-seated troubles and unresolved conflicts of one Oqual cycle may spill over well deep into the first half of the next, so as to delay the arrival of a new dawn until the second half rolls around in what can be framed as the non-canonical model. In other words, there are bound to be exceptions to the Oqual rule, as a handful of nations at any given time may find themselves in a never-ending crisis when much of the globe elsewhere is experiencing a relatively peaceful and prosperous zeitgeist during the first half of Oqual cycle. The spell of Oqual cycle is indeed stochastic rather than deterministic, in that our own actions and poor choices made in the past can sometimes come back to haunt us as they perturb the natural cadence of the Oqual rhythm, thereby producing a non-canonical behavior. In fact, such a non-canonical behavior can sometimes also befall our annual cycle when, for example, the planting of crops may have to be delayed by months or even skipped altogether during one year due to natural forces such as the drought or due to our own actions or a combination thereof, thereby accomplishing the same goal over a span of 24 months in lieu of 12. It is noteworthy that the spell of annual cycle is also stochastic, in that the impact of a hurricane season or winter on our lives varies from one year to the next, such that we can only crudely predict their severity in statistical terms rather than with any degree of certainty. However, both the Oqual cycle and annual cycle are intrinsically deterministic in that they are fixed in time with a constant periodicity such that we know in advance when the new year or new Oqual cycle begins and ends with a mathematical certainty. Importantly, the spell of Oqual cycle on our lives remains stochastic in that each new cycle unleashes new surprises, the impact of which on our society can only be gauged statistically in advance rather than with any degree of certainty. Accordingly, one must have the wisdom to separate the grain from the chaff or the noise from the signal in order to see the universality of Oqual cycle before sweeping this earth-shattering theory under the rug, as many with a narrow view of the world continue to do so. Today, the Oqual cycle is playing out in plain sight, yet hardly anyone has eyes with which they can see, nor ears with which they can hear, or even minds with which they can think, for it requires tons of energy sailing against the wind. All the while going with the wind and following the herd demands none. Admittedly, the complete societal meltdown being witnessed across much of the globe today is an eerie echo of the 1940s in a manner that we are currently navigating through an annual season that we also did exactly 12 months ago. Unlike the more familiar annual cycle, the Oqual cycle, however, lasts 84 years due to its synchronization with the Uranian year. In terms of Uranian seasonality, 2024 is therefore more or less the same year as 1940, with the next decade, 2024 to 2033, set to be very much a repeat of the 1940s, in a manner akin to the return of summer or winter every year. We have indeed been here before since the beginning of times, courtesy of the mysterious spell of Oqual cycle on our society. Yet, every time we hit a new low and lost direction, we somehow manage to drag ourselves out of the gutter to start all over again. Today we find ourselves in the gutter once again, though we are yet to face the music for our transgressions before we can see the back of tumultuous times that apparently seem to have become endemic, even though they represent nothing more than uninvited guests on their way out. Tellingly, the current Oqual cycle, 1955 to 2038, is in the latter stages of its destructive spell with Annus Horribilis, 2028, or our Day of Judgment that we encounter once every 84 years, barely years away. You are listening to the Oqual cycle in a nutshell with Amjad Farouk, an intrepid man deeply loathed and despised for his authenticity and luminosity amongst the shadow dwellers of our world. And now, Exhibit 7. What is Annus Horribilis of the Oqual cycle? Annus Horribilis is the midwinter point in the Uranian year when the southern pole of the ice giant is minimally exposed to the sunlight as it experiences its winter solstice once every 84 years. A time span dubbed aquanium, that is to Oqual cycle what annum is to an annual cycle. In line with what humanity has endured over the past millennium or so, the decade centered upon Annus Horribilis has coincided with the Oqual cycle reaching crescendo and unleashing the worst of its destructive rage upon our civilization. Since the birth of modern age in 1451, the Annus Horribilis of Oqual cycle has befallen humanity in 1524, 1608, 1692, 1776, 1860, and 1944. Spaced apart by exactly 84 years, those were really horrible times that amounted to nothing short of a hell on earth, and the like of which is encountered only once in a lifetime. Not only was the decade centered on each Annus Horribilis noted above, flanked by a synchronized and synergized wave of deadly conflicts unfolding across the globe, but it also bore witness to civil wars breaking out across many nations and culminating with the establishment of a nouveau sociopolitical system under a new world order. For example, 1944 was sandwiched between the destructive World War II, coupled with the dreadful Holocaust on one side and the bloody Indian partition, along with the chaotic births of the State of Israel and People's Republic of China on the other. America would emerge as the new hegemon taking up the reins from Britain. Likewise, 1860 was flanked by the deadly Crimean War between Russia and Turkey, coupled with the Indian Rebellion against the British colonialists on one side, and the American Civil War along with the Franco-Mexican War on the other. Britain would hold on to its global dominance, though closely checked by the rapid rise of America, just as the 19th century bid farewell. On the same token, 1776 was preceded by the Sino-Burmese War, to add to the Russo-Turkish War, and followed by the American Independence War, coupled with the Anglo-French War. America would become a sovereign nation, and Britain emerged as the new hegemon taking up the baton from France. Prior to that, 1692 was straddled with a series of deadly conflicts from the Mughal-Maratha War through the Sino-Junghar War to the 9 Years' War between France and Netherlands, with the latter supported by various European powers, including England due to its own existential crisis of the Glorious Revolution. France would emerge as the new hegemon, taking up the mantle from Netherlands. Before that, 1608 was marred by the climax of Dutch revolt in the wake of decades of a protracted conflict between Spain and Netherlands, with each supported by various European powers. Netherlands would emerge as the new hegemon, taking the helm from Spain. Finally, 1524 was underscored by the climax of Italian wars, after decades of a drawn-out conflict pitting Spain against France for the control of Italian peninsula, as well as global dominance with each side supported by various European powers. Spain would emerge as the new hegemon and Portugal having passed on the torch. It is noteworthy that while run-of-the-mill conflicts break out throughout the Oqual cycle, apocalyptic-esque wars and existential crises almost always reach their climax during the decade centered on Annus Horribilis. Simply put, each Oqual cycle begins with a honeymoon and ends in a cataclysmic Armageddon so as to break ties with the dysfunctional past and lend humanity a fresh start on its socio-political front. You are listening to the Oqual cycle in a nutshell with Amjad Farouk, an uber nonconformist born to navigate life on his own terms rather than cave into societal norms and the status quo in a world where conformity is naturally expected and herd behavior is richly rewarded. And now, Exhibit 8. How does the spell of Oqual cycle determine our fate at an individual level? Not only does the Oqual cycle throw us a lifeline in order to purge the gunk out of our society's veins so that we can break ties with our rotten system and begin anew once every 84 years, but it also helps us to understand ourselves better at an individual level. Why, for example, some people view the world through rose-colored glasses, all the while others do so through a broken lens. Such antagonistic views are very much shaped by the differential spell of Oqual cycle on our lives, in that the first half is underscored by societal good in large quantities, while evil rears its ugly head across every walk of life during the second half. In fact, successes and failures in our lives are not exclusively due to our own actions, but rather they are also beholden to space and time as we navigate the complex spell of Oqual cycle on our society. More specifically, one can rationalize the differential spell of Oqual cycle on our lives through subdividing our society into 4 distinct generational cohorts dubbed G1 to G4, which respectively correspond to the 4 21-year Oqual seasons from spring to winter. Thus, individuals born during the winter, G4 cohort of Oqual cycle largely hold a positive view of the society, since much of their adulthood coincides with its first half, inundated with plenty of optimism and prosperity across all societal strata, as was, for example, the case during much of the first half, 1955 to 1996, of the current Aquanium, 1955 to 2038. Admittedly, today's G4 cohort of elderly, roughly aged 70 or older, born during the winter, 1934 to 1954, of the previous Aquanium, 1871 to 1954, have mostly held the society and institutions in a rather high esteem up till quite recently, since the socio-political system largely worked for them throughout much of their adult lives, coincident with the first half, 1955 to 1996, of the current Aquanium, 1955 to 2038. In the face of utter socio-political upheaval unfolding before their eyes today, almost everyone amongst this G4 cohort, 1934 to 1954, from the commoner to the pundit, however, wonders why they have never seen anything like this before in their prolonged lives. Well, the Oqual cycle has news for them. We are currently navigating through the deadly Oqual winter, 2018 to 2038, renowned for overseeing a complete meltdown of our society. This is a recurring season during which today's elderly were either being breastfed or spoon-fed the last time it paid us homage, 1934 to 1954, some 84 years earlier, and when they were being shielded by their parents from the utter carnage unfolding on their doorstep. In fact, today's societal meltdown, coupled with an Armageddon lurking in the shadows, represents an eerie echo of that previous Oqual winter, 1934 to 1954, in a manner similar to the return of Jack Frost or the more familiar annual winter every year. Why even the pundits in this internet age, when access to information can be had with a click, fail to connect the dots is anyone's guess, though it does not bode well for those who garner an entourage of millions of disciples and pull our society's strings across the full spectrum of media. What is, however, certain is that it is not merely due to their lack of wisdom, even though it is a rare virtue that even widely celebrated geniuses throughout our checkered history have lacked for the most part, but more so due to the fear of facing the harsh reality, or rather inconvenient truth. The idea of being under the spell of Oqual cycle that metes out deadly punishment to humanity so as to help it cleanse itself of a baggage of evils once every 84 years is simply too nerve-wracking for some to fathom, while nail-biting for others to handle. Not to mention that there is no shortage of fools in our world who continue to subscribe to the bogus view that they control their own destiny, in spite of the fact that our lives are not only fashioned by the society of which we are inherently a part of, but that we always remain at the mercy of nature's boundless bounties. And then there are greater fools who recognize the complete breakdown of our institutions to add to the cognitive dissonance of our leaders today, yet retardedly reason that such an anarchy is unlikely to lead to the outbreak of World War III, even though it has already begun with the onset of Russia-Ukraine war in 2022, now hurtling toward its third anniversary. Not only that, but the odds of World War III slowly morphing into a nuclear Armageddon over the next decade are all but unity, in line with the unavoidable spell of Oqual cycle as it reaches crescendo. As an inconvenient truth as it might sound, such an Armageddon is all but obligatory in order to restore our socio-political equilibrium, given that the pendulum of justice has already swung too far to the left. Bereft of wisdom to unpack a phenomenon as complex as making sense of trials and triumphs of our society, today's pundits seemingly do not realize that without such a deadly punishment, humanity will never change course, and only continue to deepen its wounds that could well become irreparable before too long, so as to set it on a road to annihilation. Nor can the looming Armageddon be averted as much as knuckleheads may try to bend the laws of nature. On the contrary, the looming Armageddon serves as a blessing in disguise in the sense that it would help us cut our losses as we are impelled to pay our dues in order to get back on our feet and begin to walk with dignity and respect once more in lieu of continuing to go down the shameful rabbit hole. Talk about ignorance to add to being out of touch with reality, and it does not get any deeper than amongst the most celebrated pundits and bestsellers of our time. This, of course, evokes a profoundly philosophical question about the sanity and mental stability of the masses. Why, for example, hoi polloi tend to gravitate in droves toward propagandists and trade truth on the altar of striking resonance with propaganda, a scenario that is seemingly more prevalent amongst the G2 cohort of Oqual cycle, presumably due to their pronounced distrust of institutions. In marked contrast to the rather upbeat view of our society held by those who pop up during the Oqual winter G4 cohort, though they are often lulled into a false sense of security during their golden years due to the fact that they rarely experience a major calamity during their adulthood, as is the case with today's elderly, individuals born during the summer G2 cohort of Oqual cycle, however, mostly hold a negative view of the society since much of their adulthood coincides with its second half mired in socio-political upheaval and societal meltdown, as has hitherto been the case across much of the globe during the second half 1997 to 2038 of the current Aquanium 1955 to 2038, with the worst yet to come over the next decade or so. Indeed, today's G2 cohort of youngly, roughly aged between 30 to 50, born during the summer 1976 to 1996 of the current Aquanium 1955 to 2038, view the society as largely being a collection of oppressive institutions whose goal is to enslave and exploit the masses, in that the socio-political system has been rigged in favor of a small minority of wealthy and elite throughout what has hitherto been much of their adult lives during the second half 1997 to 2038. It is therefore hardly a coincidence that today's G2 cohort of youngly, for the most part, believe that World War III has either already begun or that it is imminent, in a rather sharp contrast to the G4 cohort of today's elderly, who not only foolishly chuckle at the illusion of a global conflict breaking out, but even go on to argue that since it has never happened during their prolonged lives, it constitutes nothing more than fear-mongering, except, of course, that the last time it happened, most of them were either in diapers or being cocooned in a hard shell with little or no knowledge of what was unfolding on their doorstep. Such a heightened sense of security amongst the elderly knows no bounds, in that they even assert that today's society is simply too civilized to become entangled in a global conflict, to add to the absurdity that nukes represent nothing more than a nuclear deterrence due to the risk of mutually assured destruction of the two parties involved in a potential nuclear war. Well, such individuals are either devoid of conscience, or they must have switched off their sensory antennas to the outside world, already mired in unbearable carnage from the Russia-Ukraine war to Gaza cost being bankrolled and fueled by the very leaders that they hold in high regard, and with the scale of both calamities not witnessed since the early days of World War II and Holocaust, having unfolded some 84 years earlier on our shores. Not to mention that, having been on cocaine for decades through running excesses and imbalances at every societal level, today's world leaders have not only turned into cheerleaders promoting and abetting genocides, but they are also sleepwalking into a potential nuclear Armageddon in a manner akin to the fate of an addict who has simply lost control of their life, in that every new step that they take, in the misguided belief that it will turn their poor state of affairs around, only serves to deepen their dilemma. Admittedly, the world leaders suffering from cognitive dissonance and a buzz with bellicosity, coupled with being fully unaware of the consequences of their grave actions, is a hallmark of Oqual winters, as for example is the case today, being in the midst of current Oqual winter 2018 to 2038, as it was the case during the previous Oqual winter 1934 to 1954, and as it will be the case once more during the next Oqual winter 2102 to 2122. Simply put, such mental wobbling and irrational exuberance of world leaders during Oqual winters plants the seeds of an Armageddon, and it is only a matter of time before all hell breaks loose with the odds of the deployment of most lethal arsenal at the disposal of warring parties being all but a mathematical certainty as they lock horns to settle the contest for the control of the world and its resources. It is not only the G4 cohort of today's elderly that does not seem to understand why World War III has already begun, and that it will soon be knocking on their doorstep with the potential to turn into a nuclear Armageddon over the next decade, but a vast majority amongst today's G1 and G3 cohorts also subscribes to such a preposterous view, though the latter could be forgiven for having barely stepped out of its shell. Unlike the G2 and G4 cohorts that are exact polar opposites in that while the latter generally views the world as being a Garden of Eden and the former mostly sees it as being a Garden of Evil, individuals who mom up during the spring, G1 cohort, and the autumn, G3 cohort, of Oqual's cycle broadly hold a rather mixed perception of the society between the two extremes noted above. Thus, individuals born during the spring 1955 to 1975 of the current Aquanium 1955 to 2038 generally view the society as so-so, since much of their adult lives have straddled across both the auspicious spell of first half 1955 to 1996, as well as what has hitherto been the ugly spell of second half 1997 to 2038, though the worst is yet to come as the Oqual cycle revs up to unleash its deadliest scourge on our society just as it bids farewell over the next decade or so. Likewise, individuals born during the autumn 1997 to 2017 of the current Aquanium 1955 to 2038 are also poised to view the society as so-so, since much of their adult lives will be straddling across both the second half 1997 to 2038 of the current cycle and the first half 2039 to 2080 of the next one. Tellingly, the worldview of those born on the cusp of an Oqual season may be somewhat different from that of their cohort in general. Nevertheless, one must understand that the spell of Oqual cycle represents only one of a myriad of forces that govern our lives and shape how we view our world during our adulthood and elderhood. For example, those born into wealthy families and brought up in privileged gated communities without any knowledge of the struggles of a common man and woman in the real world are unlikely to fall into the general characteristics of generational cohorts, G1 to G4, as viewed through the lens of Oqual cycle. Nor is our destiny solely determined in the heavens, but rather it is the product of a complex interplay between celestial and societal forces, as well as our own actions and choices that we make as we navigate the uncharted landscape of our life. Still, like the ducklings of the winter, 1934 to 1954, of the previous Aquanium, 1871 to 1954, the sucklings born during the winter 2018 to 2038 of the current Aquanium 1955 to 2038 are destined to see the world through rose-colored glasses as they come of age in about a decade or so on the other side of the looming Armageddon, from which they will, of course, be largely shielded by their parents. In fact, today's infants and toddlers, along with the babies born over the next decade or so, will be the luckiest in a lifetime, as they will come out of their shells into a world full of optimism and prosperity under the clout of renewed cultural growth and a heightened sense of community, coupled with institutional trust and a functional government that will once again deliver for the masses. However, in an echo of the plight of today's elderly and their archetype from the previous G4 cohort, 1934 to 1954, most amongst the current G4 cohort, 2018 to 2038, will live to see their world erupt into a complete meltdown during their golden years, just as the second half, 2081 to 2122, of the next Aquanium, 2039 to 2122, rolls around. To cut to the chase, we as individuals come into this world only once, and we bid farewell only once, but the cycles of nature go on forever in a perpetual tale of two contrasting halves that can be measured on a scale as small as hours and days to as large as years, decades, aquania, millennia, megania, and perhaps even longer. You are listening to the Oqual cycle in a nutshell with Amjad Farouk, a stoic man whose resilience and calm in the face of adversity have consistently powered him to sail against the wind when going with the wind would have been the much easier path to travel. And now, Exhibit 9. What does the Oqual cycle have in store for us over the coming decades? Just as life on Earth would be unsustainable without the steadfast operation of daily and annual cycles, the Oqual cycle is equally important to help us revitalize our society after evil forces within our ranks set us on a path of self-destruction once every 84 years on average. Unfortunately, the outbreak of an Armageddon with the potential to wreak havoc and strike fear into the hearts and minds of people on an apocalyptic scale is a prerequisite for breaking ties with our broken system, lest we crumble under our own weight. In particular, the odds of the outbreak of such an Armageddon ebb and flow in lockstep with the progression of Oqual's cycle and typically spike circa annus horribilis just as the 84-year rhythm reaches crescendo. Being utterly ignorant of the aquacyclical nature of history, crackpots are, however, quick to draw comparisons between today's socio-political crisis and the outbreak of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, having transpired against the backdrop of relatively prosperous times that would make the socio-political dilemmas of that era look like a stroll in the park compared to what the world is facing today. Admittedly, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was handily diffused before it became a hornet's nest due to the fact that it occurred at a time when humanity was riding high on the back of prosperous times across much of the globe with little appetite for war, not to mention that it had barely regained footing from the fallout of World War II a couple of decades earlier. Today, having long forgotten the woes and throes of hard times that our grandparents endured some 84 years ago, we, however, find ourselves in a hornet's nest, with much of the world teetering on the precipice of a total collapse to add to the jingoism of world leaders trying to test each other's resolve with nuclear brinkmanship and upping the ante as they try to outmaneuver every move of their rivals. Accordingly, containing the current crisis is not only a whole different ballgame, but it has also reached the transition state with no way to put the genie back in the bottle. The coming Armageddon is therefore a foregone conclusion in that it has already been written in the stars due to our past actions, nor can it be averted even if world leaders were to do a complete about-face today and demand that their troops be wholly withdrawn from their frontline positions. The only question today is whether the coming Armageddon will turn nuclear. On the basis of seasonal trends stretching back at least a millennium, the Oqual cycle emphatically concludes that the odds of the current crisis turning into a nuclear war over the next decade are all but unity. With the ominous decade 2023 to 2033 centered on the next annus horribilis 2028 having already kicked off, the dark clouds of yet another Armageddon set to return to our shores are indeed lurking on the horizon and threatening to rewrite history like never before. It is no coincidence that World War III has already begun with first the outbreak of Russia-Ukraine war in 2022, and then followed by Gaza cost a year later, with additional coliseums poised to open over the next couple of years or so. The latter being the ethnic cleansing conducted by Israel in broad daylight, with America lending the apocalyptic bombs and diplomatic cover for the mass extermination of Palestinians, and with Uncle Sam's European lapdogs faithfully wagging their tails and being fully complicit in the mass genocide taking place before their eyes. If the outbreak of Russia-Ukraine war did not inoculate World War III, then the onset of GazaCast most certainly did, with the potential to lasso the wider Arabosphere into the fledgling Arab-Israeli confrontation that will likely serve as the fulcrum upon which the levers of the ongoing global conflict swivel over the next decade or so. While most Arab nations today are being cowed and jawboned by Uncle Sam into turning a blind eye to the ongoing genocide of Palestinians, if not outright being in bed with Israel, it is, however, only a matter of time before the deeply enraged Arab masses turn on their despicable rulers, with the potential for many monarchies to fall like dominoes one after another during the ominous decade 2023 to 2033 of the Oqual cycle, renowned for sacrificing the old guard on the altar of a new socio-political order. Add to that the fact that the Russian fat lady is yet to sing. While many pundits have already declared the end of what is still a fledgling Russia-Ukraine war due to Uncle Sam's war chest having lately shown signs of being dried up, they would, however, live to grind their teeth for not having seen that the Eurasian conflict is, on the contrary, just getting started, and that it has hitherto served as nothing more than a curtain raiser to the Armageddon lurking on the horizon. Their naivete is akin to an alien unaware of terrestrial seasonal trends and jumping to the conclusion on New Year's Eve that the winter is over. Nor does the absurdity that Donald Trump would bring the conflict in Ukraine to an abrupt halt within hours of retaking the helm in 2025 hold water for America's foreign policy is wholly run by the deep state or swamp state, spearheaded by bureaucrats within the likes of DOD and CIA, with their tenures secured for life, and being given free rein to call the shots and pull the levers of geopolitics to enrich themselves and their cronies however they so wish at the expense of the masses. That is indeed the very reason why megalomaniac and schizophrenic Uncle Sam does what he does, irrespective of who helms the American Titanic. Should Trump redux or his second coming attest to the conman being Trumpian enough to cross the deep state, he would likely meet the same fate as the one that befell the 35th POTUS John Kennedy in 1963 after he dared to undercut the CIA's gambit to up the ante in what had up till then been primarily a low-intensity Vietnam War, but would quickly escalate into a full-fledged conflict with the rapid deployment of American troops in the post-Kennedy era. Not to mention that the powder keg upon which the world is sitting today is ballooning by the day, with the looming Armageddon set to bloat into an 800-kiloton nuclear gorilla abuzz with sheer rage and hellish destruction on his mind as he prepares to lend humanity a fresh start after having navigated to a nadir and having lost direction on how to change course. The Rubicon has indeed been crossed, and there is no off-ramp in sight. Ironically, the coming Armageddon is exactly what the world needs, as it would serve as a catharsis in disguise to purge the madness out of our society's veins. There is indeed no gain without pain. Admittedly, a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is yet to materialize, with the latter likely forced to resort to the use of nukes in order to level the battlefield and avoid facing a humiliating defeat at the hands of its immortal enemy. Likewise, Israel's gambit to exterminate Palestinians in order to annex Gaza and West Bank is seemingly turning out to be far from being a cakewalk, not to mention that it is yet to draw big cats to the conflict as the gates of hell finally begin to unlatch one after another, with Annus Horribilis 2028 barely years away. For their part, India and Pakistan are gearing up to lock horns over the disputed territory of Kashmir, just as they did some 84 years ago during the 1940s. And so are the Koreas, with the potential for the reunification of the Korean peninsula over the next decade or so also being on the cards. Nor should China be under the illusion that reunification with Taiwan, or Taiwanification, can be accomplished without firing a shot. As we inch ever closer to our rendezvous with destiny circa 2028, all these warring theaters and fronts will ultimately coalesce into a single global conflict between the axis of resistance on the right side of history and the axis of evil, destined to be left with its capitalist tail between its crooked legs for having shamelessly promoted and enabled crime against humanity, from genocides to the subjugation of the weak and vulnerable for decades across the globe. While such a recurring Armageddon has historically unfolded during the decade centered upon Annus Horribilis, the Oqual winters on the whole are in fact tantamount to being nothing short of navigating in treacherous waters, with our precarious Titanic being relentlessly pounded from every angle by storms and blizzards alike. Importantly, the Oqual winters are renowned for staging the collapse of old guard so as to make way for a new one just in time for the arrival of a new Oqual cycle. Not only do deadly conflicts and civil wars break out across the globe during the Oqual winters, but humanity also dies out for the most part, as is the case across much of the globe today. It is noteworthy that Annus Horribilis marks the midpoint of Oqual winters, as for example the coming Annus Horribilis 2028 lies at the center of the current Oqual winter 2018 to 2038. The Annus Horribilis is the year during which the 21-year southern Uranian winter reaches its zenith, which somehow seems to correlate with our world reaching the peak of its own Armageddon once every 84 years. We are indeed in the midst of a long and dark Oqual winter, just as we were some 84 years ago. Just as the previous Oqual winter, 1934 to 1954, marked the end of horrible times and heralded the beginning of several decades of relative prosperity, beginning with the 1950s and ending with the 1990s across much of the globe, so too are good old shiny happy days once again set to re-emerge from the silos as the current Oqual winter, 2018 to 2038, bids farewell. A brighter dawn is indeed set to emerge across much of the globe after the piper has been paid for humanity's transgressions amassed over the past several decades, just as World War III grinds to a halt in about a decade or so. Make no mistake, the coming Armageddon that is already upon many of us from Gaza to Haiti is destined to pay almost every corner of the world a visit by Annus Horribilis, 2028, or thereabouts, so as to enable humanity to begin anew after shamelessly having plunged itself into a deep canyon between a rock and a hard place. Simply put, the laws of nature have been breached to the hilt, and the retribution must be doled out for such transgressions in a manner akin to the parable of a criminal who is destined to never make amends until they get punched right in the face. Accordingly, the deadly punishment awaiting ahead is absolutely necessary for us to make a U-turn on a highway to hell, but without any traffic signs to help us change direction. Without such a day of reckoning, we would remain complacent and continue to stick to our guns rather than change course. Not to mention that we would also risk racing all the way to the gates of hell with the potential for driving ourselves into extinction to the ire of biology. But you bet, our biology has not just been watching this rather uncomfortable socio-political drama unfold every time it reached its finale once every 84 years since the beginning of times, but rather it has always had our back as it has gone to great lengths to make sure that we continue to live to tell the story for another day. We indeed have a built-in evolutionary mechanism to exercise restraint and tamp down collateral damage when faced with utter annihilation. The notion that humanity could one day nuke itself into extinction is nothing more than a hyperbole. As dreadful as the coming Armageddon might turn out to be, with the potential for many cities being nuked into the ground, humanity will nevertheless survive for the most part. Not only that, but like the manatee, humanity in every community will also get down with impunity to doing what it does best as soon as the nuclear dust has settled. Make babies, and lots of them, with birth rate reaching a historic high, and the sacred institution of marriage rightfully reclaiming its primal place at the front and center of human society once more. Though the baby shower will only last for a few decades before the familiar societal boogaboos once again return to our shores and plunge humanity into yet another conflict with itself, just as the 22nd century rolls around, with the odds of an even deadlier Armageddon brewing fast and furious circa Annus Horribilis 2112 of the next Aquanium 2039 to 2122. All told, the Oqual cycle has not only spoken with a jaw-dropping prescience, but it is also on track to deliver on its promise of cleaning up humanity's mess once every 84 years on average, just as it did on its previous homecomings circa 1944, 1860, 1776, and so forth. In line with the recurring spell of Oqual cycle on human civilization as it draws to a close, the following scenarios are likely to come to fruition sometime between Annus Horribilis 2028 and Annus Mirabilis 2039 on the other side of World War III, just as global reset gets into full swing. 1. A brighter dawn where hope and prosperity are once again restored for the masses will emerge across much of the globe, with most countries feeling a sense of rebirth, though a handful of nations will continue to find themselves in a perpetual limbo. Just as darkness of the night eventually yields to light of the day, so too return happy days on our shores on the back of decades of doom and gloom, though only after humanity has faced the music. 2. Far-right populist politics in most countries will take a battering as it is locked up in silos for several decades that follow, though it will once again re-emerge and reach a climax in about 84 years from now. Expect sweeping changes to occur within the ruling elite of most countries with the return of good old leaders who will once again regain the trust of the public. While it may have come close to being wiped off the map over the last couple of decades, to the shock of seasoned pundits, though perfectly in line with what the Oqual stars had in store, the Indian National Congress will be back with a vengeance in an echo of its dominance that began some 84 years ago, with the BJP becoming a shadow of its past and relegated to the fringes of Indian society. 3. Due to their baby production lines having been dried up for decades, dying nations such as Japan and Korea will see their prayers answered as baby boom becomes the new trend across much of the globe. After all, the birds of a feather flock together. 4. Greater Israel will come into being in earnest through annexation of both Gaza and West Bank, though such a gambit could fall flat on its face with the potential for the apartheid state to be completely wiped off the map, thereby making way for the emergence of a single state where Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others finally learn to live cheek by jowl for the greater good of humanity. While Israel may have jumped out of the Arabian frying pan in haste, it nevertheless seems to be destined to fall into the fire of its own waste. In an echo of the plight of European Jewry vis-à-vis Holocaust some 84 years earlier, expect at least 2 out of every 3 Palestinians to be eliminated by the time the dust settles on Gazacast in about a decade or so. 5. The plug on the Euro experiment will be finally pulled as European nations crumbling under heaps of debt wake up and recognize that their fiscal interests are best served by a national currency over which they have full control rather than being dictated by an emperor without clothes on how to run their country. With the faith in Euro having failed to move mountains, Europeans are indeed left with no choice but to accept the hard reality that a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Still, it will be the dollar rather than the euro that will ultimately come to be viewed as the straw that broke the European camel's back, thanks but no thanks to NATO. 6. Given that NATO will continue to choke Russia in its own backyard with conventional warfare coupled with refusing to back off until a total victory is achieved, and that the Siberian tiger will never accept such a humiliating defeat at the hands of its immortal enemy, the use of nukes would emerge as the only viable solution to end what would ultimately become a decade-long conflict with cities such as London and Paris through Berlin and Moscow to Manhattan and Chicago being odds-on favorite to getting nuked into the ground so as to end the suffering for all parties teetering on the verge of utter exhaustion and collapse. With the NATO fox having been guarding the Russian henhouse for decades, the chickens are indeed destined to come home to roost with a nuclear vengeance that the history will have trouble coming to terms with for generations to come. 7. Against the backdrop of World War III having turned nuclear, the NATO alliance will fall apart as Europeans finally come to their senses and realize that their security is best served without becoming a party to Uncle Sam's war machine, primarily designed to decimate nations through barbaric warfares on the altar of generating huge profits for its corporate stakeholders, or what is better known as the military-industrial complex of the United States. It is said that wise people would even consider inviting a donkey to act as their de facto daddy when a cloud is hanging over them. but one has to be as asteroid as Europeans to invite dark clouds to hang over them after having struck an unnecessary kinship with the donkey disguised as a beacon of freedom, but with the hidden propaganda of exploitation and destruction of humanity on the altar of fueling its capitalist machine to the delight of the dirty devil. 8. Russia will emerge as a born-again superpower in the footsteps of the former Soviet Union after driving NATO into extinction and reducing Ukraine to a rump state as ruble rediscovers its mojo. Powered by their distorted chutzpah of capitalism and democracy, the Americans used to make the Soviet Union the butt of their jokes, but the Russian resilience has once again proven that one who laughs last laughs longest against the backdrop of Siberian tiger rising fast and furious. All the while, United States continues to crumble under its own weight of a baggage of evils that it once vowed to export to every corner of the world. 9. India and Pakistan will get to have yet another date with destiny some 84 years after their bloody divorce, as territorial disputes are resolved for the most part, thereby ushering in a new dawn of friendship and cooperation between the two consanguineous or blood-tied nations. Keeping in mind that India and Pakistan are two branches of the same tree, expect these two nations to put their differences aside and make up for lost time as they rekindle their romance for the greater good of the masses across the Indian Peninsula, accounting for almost 25% of humanity, or equivalent to the combined population of Africa and Europe. 10. Chinese reunification or Taiwanification will finally be realized after some 84 years of bittersweet separation, albeit through a bloody conflict against the backdrop of World War III reaching a climax. A similar fate also awaits the Korean Peninsula. It is said that there is strength in unity, but now expect unity to be in strength as China turns over yet another leaf on its destined path to global glory and becomes the new comeback kid on the back of the disgraceful century of humiliation, 1839 to 1949, at the hands of Western barbarians. 11. China is destined to dethrone America to become the new hegemon as it begins to call the shots and pull the levers of geopolitics in line with its national interests, just as the Chinese yuan begins to overshadow the United States dollar to become the most powerful currency in global trade. Though the latter will continue to dominate commerce across the Anglosphere to the chagrin of Uncle Sam, left to grind his tainted teeth as the dirty old man begins a long journey of healing through deep introspection and soul-searching. It is an established fact that one must pound the iron when it is red hot, but one could perhaps only learn from China how to make the iron red hot with the blow of a hammer. 12. An end to America's unchallenged hegemony would be a blessing in disguise in that it will finally begin to build its own infrastructure and industry at home to the much delight of Americans rather than continuing to squander its energy and resources at smashing up the world into pieces in a futile cycle. In the footsteps of the proverbial cat who took off for Hajj after having devoured 900 rats, Uncle Sam will also begin to make preparations to head for the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca as the bully is finally tranquilized to the delight of the world. Though to the much ire of Wall Street scumbags left to pick up the pieces of what they had foolishly believed to be a trip to the idyllic La La Land. That is the Oqual cycle in a nutshell. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the Oqual cycle in a nutshell, and I am Amjad Farouk, the father of the Oqual cycle. I wholeheartedly commend you for becoming aware of the unavoidable spell of the Oqual cycle on our precarious society. With this newly acquired wisdom under your belt, you can now make sense of the nonsense ongoing right now across much of the world, just as it was some 84 years ago during the 1940s. And you bet, such madness will return to our shores once more in about 84 years from now, just as the 21st century bids farewell, though hardly anyone amongst us today would be around, for better or for worse. Although conceived in 2020, birthed in 2023, and introduced to the world at large in 2024, the Oqual cycle may, however, take decades or even centuries before it comes of age, as all big discoveries do. Notwithstanding the fact that the Oqual cycle is now available in the 12 most powerful languages that between them span almost every corner of the globe. In addition to English, these include French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, German, Russian, Japanese, Chinese, Hindi, Urdu, and lastly, but by no means least, Arabic. Thank you so very much for listening and for your interest in the Oqual cycle. For more information, please log on to www.oqualcycle.com. God bless. Ta-ta for now.